All right, so this summer series is an overview to the program that we've been doing for over 4 years now of Hebrew reading fluency and comprehension. And the process normally for our hour-and-a-half program is we begin with breakout rooms of people being able to read the material with each other. The material is sent prior to the session. People can practice. And so one of the goals of the group is to help enhance Hebrew reading fluency without the comprehension, simply for the sake of reading. And the breakout rooms give people of two or three in a group a chance to practice just reading fluency. Then when we come back together, we focus again on reading fluency so that we can actually make sure that we're reading the words correctly. But the next step is to look at the text itself for comprehension. And comprehension is not, as I teach it, simply a matter of translation, but a matter of translation through interpretation. And what I do is we look at the text both from the large picture and from the small picture. So we look at the structure, the process of what the Hebrew Torah is all about. And then we look at individual words, at grammar, at sentence structure, at ambiguities of Hebrew language in the Hebrew, and ambiguities of the Hebrew text in translating to another text. One of the classic examples of translating Torah that I often give is the idea that the Torah text has, except for white spaces, no punctuation. There's no vocalization, so we don't know what vowels to put to a word. And for example, the word for desert, midbar, with different vowels becomes midaber, which means speaking. And the Torah doesn't tell us whether to read it as midbar or midaber. Another example is the word for mitzvot, when put with different punctuation, becomes matzot. And so we don't know whether we're supposed to read commandments or matzahs. So there's no punctuation, there's no vocalization in the Torah. And except for, as I say, the white spaces between sections of Torah, there's no punctuation. The classic example of how you read something without punctuation is the one that I like to tell of the little old Jewish man sitting in the park under a big sign and relaxing, enjoying himself when a police officer comes along and says, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm sitting and enjoying your park." Police officer says, "But what are you doing it here? Can't you see that sign up there?" And the sign says the words, "Keep off the grass, no trespassers allowed." And the policeman says, "Don't you see the sign?" He said, "I did, that's why I'm here." He said, "What do you mean that's why you're here? Can't you read it? It says, keep off the grass, no trespassers allowed." And the little Jewish guy says, "No, that's not what it says." He says, "It's not what it says? What does it say?" It says, "Keep off the grass, no trespassers allowed." So punctuation, of course, is very important. English has wonderful books about let's shoot grandma. I hope we put the comma in the right place.
I'm easily amused.
Well, so the Torah text has that. So let's start by looking at the larger picture of the opening passage of Genesis. And this particular website that I use is called Scroll Scraper.
Oh, God.
Which is SCROLLSCRAPER, Scroll Scraper. If you just Google that, you'll be able to get to it. And Scroll Scraper gives you the Torah as it looks and the Torah with the Masoretic vocalization and punctuation. And it also happens to give you be a site where you can learn the laning because of the trope. But I won't get into the trope. But if you take a look at the opening chapter of Genesis, you see a section, a section, a section, a section, a section, a section, long section, and then a section, and you'll notice this one right here is actually in the vocalized and punctuated text at the beginning of chapter 2.
No, I don't
You
see.
wouldn't know that from looking at the text, whether this is chapter 1 or chapter 2. But the rabbis, the Masoretes, chose to divide it from ending with Yom HaShishi, with the 6th day, and then beginning chapter 2 with what happened on the 7th day. That will become important as far as why they divided it up that way. If the creation includes Shabbat, which is the 7th day, then why didn't they put it into chapter 1? Why did they put it in chapter 2? We look at that. But this shows you that basically it's day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then chapter 2 does not end with the pattern of 7th day, but ends with a whole little different kind of structure. So when we look at translation, we look at that structure as well. That's big picture look at it, view of it. The second thing that I think is important to do when looking at Torah text is to look at Torah stories, look at unit groups. And the way to, I believe, understand Torah is to look at the way the Torah story is constructed. The way to do that is to look at the opening of the story and the closing of the story. Basically, Torah stories seem to be some kind of morality or some other kind of text that demonstrates a process. So we go to the beginning of the Genesis story, and it begins with Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. This is a story about creation, the beginning of creation, and the story of creation ends after 6 days of creation with Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa v'hine tov ma'od vayhi erev vayhi vokir yom hashishi. So in a 6-stage process, we get the creation story, beginning with what we will see when we look at the basic structure, beginning with chaos and concluding with perfect order. And throughout the text, we're going to hear this is Tov, this is Tov, this is Tov, but it ends with Tov Ma'od. So it's very Tov. Everything along the way is Tov, but when it's all done, it's very Tov. And again, not translating the word Tov yet, because while it translates into English most generally as good, good even in English has different connotations and context. So all we know is that we begin with something that there's no Tov, and then through a 6-step process, we go through 6 sets of Tovs, ending with Tov Ma'od. So we move from chaos to order. And the process, again, as we will look at it when we look at the fine structure, is actually not just 6, but it's 2 sets of 3. So not only is there moving from chaos to order in creation, but there's moving from chaos to order in a very balanced and definitive process. The first set of 3 will be the creation of the universal elements. And then the second set of 3 will be the Earth-specific elements. And again, we'll look at that in detail. The process of doing translation then is something that I've done by giving you translation pretty much word for word rather than good English. Sometimes the Hebrew actually is good Hebrew, but to translate it into good English loses the words. And so the other part of comprehension that I develop in our program is word understanding. And word understanding begins with the very first word because there's no way of actually translating the word Bereshit into English that gives you a definitive understanding of what the word Bereshit means. So Reshit is an ordinal statement and indicates a beginning. The root is Rosh, which means head, but also means beginning or the top. So Rosh Hashanah is not the head of the year, but the beginning of the year. And we use head, by the way, in navigational terms when all those boats appear outside of Mass General and we have the head of the Charles. So Rosh is the beginning. Rosh is the instigation point. So Reshit is a statement of that kind of beginningness. Bereshit would therefore be in beginning. Another point about Hebrew is Hebrew makes a distinction between indefinite and definite articles by either putting in the definite article the or leaving it out. So there's no Hebrew equivalent to a or an. But Bereshit is a lack of the definite article. So therefore, to translate it as in the beginning is already a mistranslation of the actual Hebrew. It's Bereshit, in a beginning, or in beginning. Further complicating is Hebrew prepositions don't directly match up with English prepositions. And the Hebrew preposition be means either in or with. And so one could translate not Bereshit as in beginning or in a beginning, but Bereshit with Reshit. And Reshit could be a proper noun rather than a common noun. Again, in Hebrew, lacking uppercase and lowercase letters, we don't know whether something is a proper noun or a common noun. So Reshit might be not simply the word beginning, but might be some word of Reshit, something, some definite thing. So one could translate even, and some commentaries do, translate Bereshit as with Reshit, bara Elohim, created God. So God created with Reshit. And Reshit, in other texts, the rabbis tell us, have a connection to the sense of wisdom. And therefore, one could translate with a little bit of a stretch, and commentaries do, with wisdom God created. Not indicating actually any beginningness, but simply saying in doing creating of the heavens and the earth, God did it with wisdom, which would again point to the idea that there's balance, there's order placed on chaos. This is done by plan, with some kind of plan in mind. The next thing that we look at in text is the idea that modern form criticism says that when there are two different sets of stories coming from a different point of view, they were actually originally two different sets of stories, not two parts of the same story. So chapter 1 is a creation story that begins with a sense of creating, because the word bara is a creating word. And chapter 2, verse 4 begins again with a story of creating with a creating word. And so therefore chapter 1 and chapter 2, verse 4 are the beginning of two separate stories from two separate vantage points. And over the course of looking at the text itself, word by word, concept by concept, and with comprehension, we see how those two stories actually show two different, possibly two different sets of society or two points of view. For this series, I'm not going to do every word translation the way that we do, because the reason we've only gotten through 45 chapters of Genesis in 4 years is we only look at about 8 to 10 verses a week. And if I did that, we wouldn't even finish chapter 1 by the end of the summer. So this is, as I say, an overview introduction to what the whole process of what we do together. But to give you a taste of that, verse 1, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Couple of things as far as words and Hebrew construct. The word et in Hebrew tells us that the next thing that follows it is the definite direct object of the verb. So hashamayim is the direct object of the verb. And then in line 2, haaretz is another definite direct object of the verb. Hebrew is a case language, and so therefore word order is not crucial. Verbs can come before nouns or after nouns, and often word order in Hebrew is created for emphasis rather than for the flow of syntactic understanding. In English, dog bites man and man bites dog are two different conceptual frameworks. In Hebrew, dog bites man and man bites dog. The dog and the man would have case indicators telling us whether they're subject or object, and the word order is not important. So Elohim bara, God created, or bara Elohim, created God, is the same thing. Elohim is the subject, bara the verb, and the et hashamayim and et haaretz are then the direct objects of the verb. So we have a fairly simple statement that we have no idea what it really means. And that's going to be fairly typical and the beauty and power of Torah, because when we don't understand exactly what it means, we have to look at either the context at the society that wrote it or our own selves that we bring to Torah. And therefore interpretation, whether historical, archaeological, form critical, literal, traditional, or psychological, is all open to Torah, which is why we can do Saturday morning Torah study for all of our lives and get something different every year when we come to the same passages. So somehow Bereshit, somehow there's an indication that creation is now happening, either with a plan or in a beginning. And God is doing the creating. Bara is actually the perfect tense. So it's the past tense usually translated in English. God created the heavens and the earth at some point of starting or with some definitive plan. In doing that, verse 2 now gives us the precursors to the creation. So v'ha'aretz, and the earth. So we have the shamayim created, the heavens, and the aretz, the land, the earth created. And we're going to start with the earth. The haaretz, hayata tohu vavohu. So I'm going to expand now so we get a better view of what we're looking at. Okay, so the haaretz and the land, hayata is the feminine past tense of the, or perfect form of the verb to be. So the land was. And the land was tohu vavohu. Tohu and vohu are words that have no real translation from Hebrew into English. And modern scholars tell us that they're actually callbacks to some form of Akkadian or Sumerian or some other Middle Eastern mythology of Tiamat and other kinds of monsters in the pantheon of pre-creation. But the word va in Hebrew means and usually it's v, as in the word above. But when it's va, usually it says this is a pair of something. Tohu vavohu. Tohu and vohu then are often translated into English as unformed and void. But tohu and vohu can also be seen as two sides of the same coin, or two poles of the same magnet. A reminder that Hebrew lives with a sense of paradoxical dichotomy, that nothing exists in Hebrew without some opposite. Everything is in paired opposites. If there's a right, there must be a left, because if there's no left, there can't be a right. If there's an up, there must be a down. And so tohu and vohu are equally translated into chaos, the paired concepts of chaos. One could translate tohu and vohu into modern quantum physics as matter and energy, which are simply two sides of the same coin, because Einstein invented the ability to interchange one with the other. Not really. Simply taught us that they are interchangeable. So tohu and vohu, matter and energy intertwined. Tohu and vohu can be translated into my favorite term, singularity. And I taught chapter 1 of Genesis at MIT when I was the rabbinic advisor there in terms of the Big Bang and quantum physics. And it works. So the earth, which is a definite thing, we're told was an indefinite thing. The earth wasn't. It was chaos. And next we get the choshech. Choshech is the word for dark or darkness. So we have matter and energy intertwined with one another, chaos in a state of constant flux, and we have darkness, and darkness is simply there is no light. So again, translating this into modern physics, there was chaos and there were no photons. And the choshech was al panei tahom, and you notice again, tahom has a callback to the tohu. So choshech is on the face of the chaos. Beruach Elohim merachefet al panei hamayim. And now there is a ruach, which is both spirit and wind, but also strength. And it's the ruach of Elohim, the spirit of Elohim, which would be the wind of Elohim. And again, we only know there is wind if we see the wind affecting something. If you are looking out at a totally blank landscape, you have no idea if the air is moving or not until you see some dust moving or some leaves moving or something. So again, the indefined element of God is hovering, merachefet al pnei hamayim, on the face of the waters. And one has to ask, where did these waters come from? So we have precursors to creation in verse 2, which are ultimate chaos, wind, water, and darkness. So chaos now is defined for us as dark, windy water. Imagine then the early tellers and hearers of this story and who they were and how they related to this story of the creation, this placing by God of order onto the pre-chaos of the world or the universe or whatever. I posit that this was a coastal people for whom dark, windy water would be the ultimate chaos because you are out on the Mediterranean at night in your boat in the middle of the most violent possible storm, a Mediterranean hurricane. You don't know which way is up or down. Water is all around. Darkness is there. And the first step of putting some order into this chaos is verse 3. Vayomer Elohim yehi or, vayehi or. Important to verse 3 is the word or, which means light. In our physics quantum translation, the first thing that's created is photons. So God says, and God creates here by divine fiat. God states, and it is. God says, yehi or, will be or. Again, now we're in the imperfect, the future. God says, will be or, vayhi or, and there was or. Will be light, and there was light. This process of creation then follows a very similar pattern for every step of creation. God says it, it is it, and then God looks at it, and God says, Tov. So verse 4, Vayar Elohim, God sees, Et haor, God sees the or, the light, Ki Tov, and Tov, it's Tov. Whatever Tov means. Tov here could not be a good statement of some valuation, because then we would have been told that the Choshech was Ra, was the opposite of Tov, was bad. Yes.
You flipped by saying the imperfect was the future.
Imperfect, we usually translate it the future because
How
it's
come?
not yet done.
So the imperfect is unfinished
Right.
rather than a time orientation.
Exactly. Hebrew basically defines verbs in terms of perfect and imperfect, finished and unfinished, which we usually translate into English simply as past and future. But again, getting to a very strange Hebrew structure in Vayehi. Yehi is the imperfect, will be. The Va tells us that the tense reading of the verb should be the opposite of what we would normally translate it. So the Va tells us that this imperfect is in the past. If it were a perfect verb with Va, it would be the perfect is in the future. So here the completed action is in the past. Or rather, the uncompleted action is in the past. Or if it were in the opposite way, it would be the completed action is in the future. So Vayehi doesn't actually translate as there was or it was, but actually translated as it was that it will be. And again, makes for very awkward English. We have to do all sorts of strange things in English to make our imperfects and our perfects in the opposite direction. So Yehi or will be light, not yet done. Vayehi or, and it was not yet done. Because God's not finished with the light. Verse 4 is going to be further working with the or. So the light came out, but it wasn't done. So God looks at the light and says, yay, Tov. Done with that step. It's good. And then God takes the light and Vayavdel. Yavdel is a word for separating. On Saturday night, we do Havdalah, the service of separating Shabbat from the oncoming secular week, between the sacred and the mundane. So Vayavdel, God now separates Bein Ha'or Uvein Ha'choshech, between the light and between the darkness. And so now the darkness becomes a something rather than a nothing. So darkness becomes a thing rather than the absence of another thing. And we know that from the never-ending story. When the darkness, for those who may remember that movie, the darkness is coming to overtake the world. And he says, darkness is not nothing, darkness is something. So we have now light coming out, and the light and the dark are separated from each other. And Bain in Hebrew means between. In Hebrew, we generally use between for the things that are separated. So Bain Ha'or, Uvein Ha'choshech. In English, we would say between the light and the darkness. But Hebrew says between the light and between the darkness. But just two different words that work in English as one. So again, going back to our image of the person in the boat at night in the hurricane, at least dawn breaks and you can see light coming through the clouds and the rain and the water and the wind. And you can tell when it's day and when it's night. And that's going to be verse 5. Vayikra Elohim, and called God. God called Laor. Again, literally, that means God called to the light. Translating into English, usually God called the light. But that, again, is the difference between Hebrew prepositions and English prepositions. God called to the light and yelled out, hey, light, yom. So God called to the light, day, v'lachoshech kara laila, and God called here to the darkness, laila, night. So one can translate it as, by interpretation, God named the light time yom, day, and God named the dark time night. But one could also say that God named them by calling out to them. So God said, there will be, and there was, and then God gives them names by calling them Yom and Lila. Further Hebrew confusion finishes verse 5. Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom Echad. And there was an Erev, an evening, and there was Boker, a morning, and it is day one. doesn't say first day, it says day one. And here Yom is the light time. And here Yom is the 24-hour period, or the time from Erev to Boker, from evening to morning, which is usually the darkness time. So either Yom is both the light time and the whole time, or Yom is the light time and the dark time. And Yom Echad, which can be translated as one day, can also be translated as day of one. And we know Echad by rabbinic interpretation. Echad is God, because we say it every morning and every night. We say, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. We say, God is Echad. So therefore, one could say that Yom Echad is day of God. Which, by the way, day one, if Shabbat is day 7, then day 1 is Sunday. So this can be validation of the fact that Sunday is God's day. Whether or not that was true in this particular ancient biblical world, what they meant by Yom Echad, whether they meant day 1 or day of 1 or one day. But the statement here that there was evening and there was morning is the also the root of Jewish time counting the day from Erev. Evening is the beginning of the next day because the chapter 1 says so. It also makes sense for a seafaring people that they knew exactly when evening was. Some people might have slept through the morning. So you count your day from when you see one day end and the next day begin. Now, I'm going to take you back. So that's word by word, concept by concept, confusion by confusion of just the first 4 verses of chapter 1. And you can see why it can take us an hour to go through 4 or 5 verses.
Took us longer.
It's probably,
Oh, yeah.
again, jumping into the beginning, this really frames the Torah as we would read it for the entire rest of the Torah. Is how we work our way through chapter 1 really sets, I believe, the tone for how we do all of Torah. So let me go back to and just show you our overall structure of how this all works and give you the pattern. I'll make it smaller. Okay. Day 1. Then the next group ends with Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, and you can see we're exactly the same. Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi. Every set ends with exactly the same words. And there was evening, and it was morning, and then first one, Yom Echad, day 1, day of 1, one day. But then we switch from cardinal to ordinal, and Yom Sheni, second day. And then the third one, Yom Shlishi, third day. Then the fourth one, Yom Revi'i, fourth day. Yom Chamishi, fifth day. And finally, the end of chapter 1, Yom Hashishi. And notice Yom Chamishi, no definite article. Yom Revi'i, no definite article. Yom Shlishi, no definite article. Yom Sheni, no definite article. Yom Echad, not Yom HaEchad, not day of the one. but day of one or one day. And finally, at the end, Yom HaShishi. And now the sixth day, or day of the sixth. So somehow Shishi, in addition to our statement above it, where everything else had been Tov, now here we have Tov Ma'od. We have Yom HaShishi, the sixth day. And again, as I would teach it, interpret it, those are two key indicators by the biblical orator, the original biblical author, to the original biblical audience, that we have come to the end of this story. Again, without punctuation, because oral language doesn't contain punctuation unless you're Victor Borge. You needed other things to indicate some punctuation. One of the ways that that happened was changing Geffen to Gafen, Eretz to Aretz, the way we read it. So I would say that this was Vihine Tov Ma'od, as opposed to Kitov, 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 Vihine Tov Ma'od. And then Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom HaShishi. So we have some indication possibly of the way it might have been read to tell us we've come to the end of the story. So the opening chapter of the Torah, the opening chapter of Genesis, moves us from ultimate chaos to, in 6 steps that are defined as Erev and Voker, or stage 1, day 1. In day 1, light. Good for the person in the boat if there's light. Day 2, we have then a firmament separating the water above from the water below. And day 3, we have earth and water separated. Imagine you're in the boat, at least you can tell day and night. Then it stops raining and you can see the sky. Then you can see land in the midst of all the water. Day 4 then is the stars, the sun, and the moon, the inhabitants of the light, the bearers of light, or the light elements. So you're out on the boat and the clouds break. You can see the sun and the moon and the stars, which means now you can navigate. Day 5, in which was created the sky and the water, we have birds and fish. So now you can see birds and fish, which means your water is a little less deep. And the birds are there, which means there must be land, and you can see the land. And then day 6, you can see that the land is inhabited, because you can see animals on the land. And then you see not only is it inhabited, but it's civilized, because you can see people in the land. And now you know you can get home. You can see, you can navigate, you can see land, and you can see a safe harbor with people waiting to say, glad you made it through the storm, unless you happen to be in a big fish for 3 days and you get thrown up on the land.
A question, are there in Jewish scholars literal minded people who say this is how it was, rather than saying what seems obvious, that this was a much constructed piece of literature? This is not news reporting.
Right. Yes, sort of. the main differences in Hebrew interpretation of the Torah is what would be called the traditional or rabbinic or religious, and the liberal, the modern, the scholarly. But even among the traditional rabbinic commentators, there are indications that many of them don't take this as
Gospel?
literal fact. You won't find Jewish supporters very much within the Flat Earth Society, within the Creationist Museum, in a little bit of a fundamentalist part of America, but rather the statement is, yes, this is fact, but no, it's not history.
Yeah, that's the key difference.
Exactly. What is the purpose of God doing this and God telling us that God did it? And that again becomes the commentary, the midrash, all of the rest of it. So no, you should not be using Genesis chapter 1 as a history text, whether you're liberal or traditional, but how you use it as a sacred text becomes different between the two.
Right.
So even within fundamentalist Judaism, you're generally not going to get a parallel to fundamentalist Christianity.
You're lucky.
Well, how would they deal with the differences? We're going to get to story 2. There's some, I guess they try to, I don't know, massage them.
Right. Well, this is a life lesson. This is God did this, and we have more, rather than trying to say God did it and it really is the way, and therefore there were no dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were just part of the original creation that were hidden as ways of confusing archaeologists and paleontologists. They would read this, the tradition reads this much more as this is how God did it, and we do not have the capacity to understand how it really worked.
Let alone all the details of what worked.
Exactly. So notice, by the way, sun, moon, and stars are created in day 4, which means days 1, 2, and 3 are how long?
Long time.
A planet circling, an exoplanet circling a star in a habitable zone that circles every 5,422 days would mean that a year is 5,422 days long. And the day on that planet, where the planet's rotational period is 14,000 years, means a day is 14,000 years long on that planet.
Well, that makes as much sense as anything to me, actually, that the days aren't all 24 hours. That
right. So this was not,
again,
that's further evidence that the biblical author, I would say certainly, and the rabbinic interpretation later of the biblical material, taking mythology as being sacred history in a sense, does not even try to wrestle with, is this really literally 6 days as we treat them today? But these are 6 days in God's realm.
Yeah.
And there is even a commentary that says, for example, later in the next creation story, which is going to be the story of Adam and Eve, we're told that God tells Adam that on the day that you eat from the fruit, you will die, which can be translated as you will become mortal or susceptible to death. But for those who want to take it literally, on the day that you eat it, you will die, they go to a psalm where it says, a day in your eyes, God, is like 1,000 years to us. And Adam and his descendants, not one of them makes it to 1,000 years. Methuselah misses by 31 years, but on the day that they die, that is over the course of the next 1,000 years of their life, they will die. So that's again a rabbinic interpretation of a text that I would posit was probably to the original biblical author viewed in the same way as all other mythologies of the ancient Near East. Not that they called it mythology, That's our term,
That's Boltzmann,
but they treated it as what we treat as mythology.
which
And
is
so,
true, but not fact.
Exactly. The further, the final then approach to Torah that this tells us is that the Torah contains mythology and legend.
Mhm.
Very little actual, what we would in our modern days call history. I differentiate between mythology, which is just so stories, explaining how the world is that it is without any basis on actual fact, and legend, which are just so stories or morality tales or something else, explaining how the world is, but based on some form of kernel of actual historical fact. Finding that actual historical fact often in Jewish view is irrelevant. So we're not looking for the kernel of fact in the legend, nor are we looking for the mythology to be fact, but we are looking for the lesson and the reason why we were given the Torah, which was not as a history book, but as a societal structure book. And so God now, unlike the gods of the ancient Near Eastern mythologies, who were highly capricious and at war with one another, our God is a God who, by plan, wants humans to live in a world of order against the origin of chaos. So chapter 1 is going to be order out of chaos. Again, in this summer series, I'm not going to be doing every word, but my translations that you have give you that sense of every word. Next time, we're going to be doing chapter 2, verse 4, which is a creation story all over again.
So you're meeting every Sunday?
We're doing this every Sunday through July and August, from 10:45 to 11:30
I'm going.
approximately. Specifically not for the in-depth that we've done, but rather for an overview of how we got there. One final note, again, about the separation of the text into different forms. You'll notice that in my translation of this particular, what I call E and P Genesis, after verse 31, comes chapter 5, verse 1. And again, if you read it from the chapter, verse 31 to chapter 5, verse 1, and you did not know that there were chapters 2, 3, and 4, you would not feel a disconnect.
Yeah.
But verse 31 flows very neatly into chapter 5, verse 1. And in fact, chapter 5, verse 2 repeats statements made in the 6th day of chapter 1.
And I won't be here next week.
Okay, I will be recording again.
Thank you.
And I will be putting out